this isn't some new thing that just started. This has been boiling for at least 30 years. And it, after the Second World War, abstract expressionism pretty much took over the art world in New York. And the emphasis behind abstract expressionism was that two-dimensional art was far more intellectual than three-dimensional art. And for abstract expressionism to really be successful, three-dimensional representational art had to be kind of disqualified in many respects. So after the Second World War, after the 50s, anything that was portrayed in three-dimensional representation was considered illustration. So there's been a big, long 40-year winter on realistic art. Now, you think, well, what about pop art? Pop art's realistic. Yeah, pop art is realistic, but pop art is about appropriating things around you and reflecting your culture back to you through the objects that you function in. Well, this leaves out imagination and a lot of craftsmanship and daring and abstract thinking. So that just had to be put aside. So what do you do with 40, 45 years of talented artists with imaginations that can draw and paint? Where do you put those people? Well, they have to be comic book artists or tattoo artists or advertising illustrators or one thing or another, work for the movie industry. So you had this big, long, dry spell of people that had these remarkable capabilities and imagination. Now, first let me say this. I'm not denigrating abstract expressionism. I'm a big fan of abstract expressionism. When you go into a bank or a big building and you see that big, beautiful abstract painting there, that's nothing else would work better than abstract expressionism. But the problem was abstract expressionism totally dominated for 20 or 30 years, only to be replaced with pop art and then conceptualism. So you're getting further away from talented draftsmanship. Now, when I went to art school back in the 60s, early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, I liked to draw. Well, I came into the world at the wrong time because I was straightened out that you know, I had an impacted sense of aesthetics, and that I should not suggest perspective or depth in the art world. So anyway, I went from job to job as a draftsman and illustrator, but always painting. So in the late 60s, I got involved with Zap Comix. It was an outlaw underground comic book that came out in San Francisco. And then I found I'm with some very, very other talented artists that had the same problem. They could draw and paint and think, but there was no place for them in the fine arts world. So Zap Comix was a remarkable imagination venue. It just affected a whole generation of young people. But I still wanted to be a painter and not a comic book artist, but my draftsmanship skills got better and better, and I got further away from what I wanted to be in the fine arts world. I did some really beautiful paintings I was proud of, but I had no way to show them in galleries or museums or whatnot. They just weren't tolerated. So along came the punk rock movement in the late 70s and 80s. And in New York and Los Angeles, they had these after-hours clubs that for a reason to sell liquor without a license, they had art shows, these punk rock art shows. So I figured, well, I can slap this stuff together pretty fast. I'm a good draftsman, you know. These clubs cater to young people that or have drinking too much or on drugs or one problem after another. I think I can graphically satisfy these people's interests. So this is the first time I found a peer group of other artists that were slapping out these aggressive, I don't know how to really describe it, in other words, taste was not an issue with the pictures. It was energy, pure energy. And this was not for the general public. This was for young people. So in no time at all, I developed a remarkable reputation as a punk rock artist, and I had a peer group for the first time in the fine arts world. So anyway, as time went on through the 80s, there's more young people got in on this, and I was getting a lot of write-ups in rock and roll magazines, tattoo magazines, biker magazines, hot rod magazines. I was getting an enormous reputation. I still wasn't in the fine arts world proper. So anyway, in 1994, we started a magazine called Juxtapoz. I was the founder. And Juxtapoz catered to this very large growing audience of young artists that were disenfranchised. See? So the closest way I can describe this art in this room and most of it in that other room is feral art. Art has kind of raised itself up by its scruff of its own neck. Okay? So anyway, Juxtapoz started selling really good. And then time passed. It started out as a quarterly, and then it got to be bi-monthly, and then it was monthly, and then its sales all over the United States and Europe. It exceeded the sales of Art Forum, then it exceeded the sales of Art in America, then it exceeded the sales of the big one, Art News, and now Juxtapoz Magazine, for this kind of crap, is the top-selling art magazine in the world. And 20 years ago, the academic art world would not look at Juxtapoz. Now it's in every classroom, and they have to deal with Juxtapoz Magazine because you have all these enormously talented young people. And I don't want to be modest, but I am the father of this situation, good or bad, see? So when you look around this room and you see this stuff, it's questionable taste, it's overworked, you know, it certainly would not lend itself as decoration in your home, you know. Well, people say, well, you know, I like his work, but I wouldn't have it in my house. Well, no, it isn't meant for your house. It's meant for a special viewing chapel for the painting. Nonetheless, this feral kind of art, I wrote a number of manifestos. I tried to get other artists to define what direction they wanted to go, but they seemed literarily impacted. So it come back on me, and a number of these artists say, well, Robert Williams doesn't speak for me. Well, I have to speak for them when they get in trouble. You're seeing an interesting phenomenon here, that if I wasn't born, this was going to happen anyway. This is coming. People like to look at pictures. And I really don't know where to take it beyond that, but, you know, it's just a form of art that is taking care of me, taking care of my friends. There's some of my peers that I helped get started, and now multi-millionaires and far, far more successful than me, having European shows. And, you know, this thing is something that cannot be ignored. They're just, this is like the genie's out of the bottle kind of art. So, you know, some people call it lowbrow. That was the original name that I gave it 40 years ago. Then people wanted a little more tame name, and they started calling it pop surrealism. Now, let's analyze that name, pop surrealism. Well, pop art depends on appropriation, and this kind of art does not do that much appropriating. And when it comes to surrealism, you have to understand surrealism was a manifesto. It was a communist manifesto. It was written in the 20s that never survived World War II. And when you think of surrealism, you think of Salvador Dali. Well, Salvador Dali was thrown out of the surrealist movement early on because the surrealist movement was not basically about type realism. It was about spontaneous work done from the subconscious. So all these titles for this kind of art movement, they kind of fall short. And so all I can refer to this is just kind of like a feral form of art. Okay? Now, I'm sure wiser people than me are going to come along, writers or art critics are going to come along, and they're going to encapsulate this with a nice name. But up to this point, it's just kind of a fringe form of art. Now, the other thing I'd like to point out to you is this kind of art I would never, ever want to see this kind of art be extremely successful. And I would not want to be a young art student and have to be subject to having to do this kind of art, because this is masochist artwork. This takes an enormous amount of sacrifice, and I certainly wouldn't want to have a gun to my head and say, well, you got to do this real tight artwork. You know? I do it because it's a compulsion with me, and I would never impose this on other people, or the values of this art on other people. But the important thing about this kind of art is it's wide open when it comes to imagination, and there hasn't been in the last century or up to now a wide open avenue that just lets your imagination go as far as it can take you. And so you look at this stuff around here and you go, what was this guy thinking? You know, well, believe it or not, I've got the brakes on when I think a lot of this stuff. It's been edited and re-edited and whatnot. So anyway, this kind of art is starting to get recognition in New York. New York's the art capital of the world. Now here's the deal about New York. New York was the art capital of the world after the Second World War, because Europe, Paris, was in real dire straits. So everyone in the world looked toward New York. Well, New York got so academic and so controlled and so constipated that you had to actually involve yourself in the society of New York before you could elevate yourself. Now, almost every museum in the United States, and probably Europe and Japan, looked to New York for parental guidance in the arts. And by the time art got to California, and it tried to maintain East Coast sophistication, things kind of got sloppy. You know, the Brooks Brothers suits kind of turned into cutoffs and Hawaiian shirts and flip-flops. So as much as Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle tried to have that sophisticated air, they kind of failed. And that's why this stuff has got a great foothold on the West Coast, because you got hot rod art, you got surfing art, you got underground comics, you got psychedelic posters, you got tattoos, you got all these different kinds of art that come off the West Coast, all this imagination that a regular museum would probably never tolerate, but they're having to come to grips with this. Like, that's why this stuff is so rich in its origin from the West Coast. It's not so much worshiping the West Coast as that the West Coast was like a fertile place for this thing. They're not meant to awe you, but they are. There's a certain amount of imagination that goes in here that tries to pull an investigative personality out of you and gets you drawn into them. They're entities unto themselves. I can only speak for myself. You got a room in there, a whole bunch of young artists that have been influenced by this, but I'm sure they have their own direction. So I can't sit here and say, well, they're my followers. They're not. But I did knock a hole in the wall from the pass-through about 25 years ago. So I don't know. I'm going to have to just let you guys ask some questions, and then I'll run with the ball. Yeah. Well, the idea process, that's what you're talking about? Well, the first rule is never do anything someone else has already done. The second rule is never do the same thing twice. So I sit around and I come up with the most ridiculous ideas that are not applicable. I know, but no one's thought of before, but they're just not applicable for a painting. So I got 30 or 40 of these ideas, and I want to make a poetic link, make it a lyrical story into the picture. So I start going through all this stuff that I've worked out till I find things that actually had like a poetic tidy to each piece, you know. And so there's not like really a set way to come up with the imagination of these pictures. It's a variety of different things. It's playing on anxieties I have, fears that I have. How should I present this to people in certain notions? I can't really sit down and I don't have a formula. That my only formula is come up with a lot of ideas and get those checks in the mailbox. You know, these things really started selling well back in the 80s. You know, there was an enormous market for these paintings. I had 8 sold out shows in a row, and that was just unheard of. And so a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon and whatnot. And as more people jumped on the bandwagon early on, the more trite and watered down a lot of the material got. And they got on a tiki thing. There's 1,000 artists doing tikis, and then they were doing skulls. All these artists doing skulls. And then now the current thing now is big-eyed children. You have hundreds of sensitive, caring people doing big-eyed children. You know, and that's just, you know, I don't sound critical. If you want to do big-eyed children, well, great. You know, but I can see that that's on the slippery slope. Anyway, I would, when I was young, I was a truck driver, a short order cook, a forklift operator, a ditch digger. I worked for a carnival. I baled hay. You know, I did everything, washed dishes. So I know what work is. So when I sit at the canvas, man, that sucker's gonna have work in it, because I'm sitting home comfortable. I didn't on the seat of a tractor out in the sun. See? So I have a good understanding of what labor is, and it's awful a lot easier to work your tail off at an easel or a drawing board than it is to go out and flip hamburgers. So, I'm getting carried away. Is there any more questions?
Yes, you sit down at the canvas after you've got all the early work done. About how much time is spent on some of these larger pieces?
Well, if I'm practical and I look at this thing on a dollars and cents basis and care for my responsibilities, I shouldn't do it at all because it's not practical, and it's I don't love doing artwork. It's a compulsion that I cannot stop, and once I get into that painting owns me. The happiest days when that thing's finished and I sign it and that baby's out of my life. Then I can come back a couple of months and reflect on it and go, oh man, I like that. So it's not a practical point on this thing. And I'll tell you, as I told the gentleman here earlier, I don't go around and encourage people to be an artist. That's a failing situation to be an artist. It just, I just had to be one. But I've taught art at art schools and whatnot, and I just do not want to encourage young people that have to do this sort of thing. But if they have to do it, this is what they got to do, then I'll help them out. I'll be glad to talk with them. But never under any circumstances do I lead them down a foggy path of the future. So, is there any other questions? These things are subversive. And they are poison to some people. They are questionable. There's no doubt about this stuff is questionable, and so I don't know, I appreciate these people's daring to have these 2 shows, but and this isn't flowers and puppies. And the deeper you get into it, the more questionable it is. But I certainly would not want to hurt anybody, I'll tell you. I was giving a lecture at LSU to 1,300 people, and a policeman stood up and he says, how do you justify the violence, the sex and violence in these pictures? And I said, well, when I see blood, I pass out. But, I have to portray the pathos of the human condition. And I don't think there's a person in this audience understood how many people died at the Battle of Verdun or the Second Battle of the Marne. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of men died that nobody cares about in this room. Okay? That's just because it's unpleasant. It's unpleasant to think about the suffering of man. So I rest my case.
Do you think we're always headed toward what you produce now? Was that kind of always what your wish was, or was that?
Well, I'm doing the kind of artwork that I always wanted to do all my life. Okay, but years ago, I'd show my peer group artists who were all abstract expressionists, and they say, "Well, you're not an artist; you're an illustrator." See, so that I kind of had to carve my own path here. Another point I want to make is we're talking about bikers and me as a hot rodder and working for Robt and all this. I do have an academic background, and I do have a working knowledge of art history, and I study art history a lot. If for nothing else, to be able to talk to other intellectuals and hold my own. So I can get around well-educated people with Bachelor of Fine Arts degrees, and I can discuss the difference in Monet and Manet, see? So, and I have to do that to justify what I do. I can't say, well, I just like what I like. You know, I can't do that. I have to say, well, such and such, and there's a difference between Picasso and Pissarro. You know, I have to go back and know the art movements and go back to the Renaissance and understand the very early cave paintings and be able to discuss this on an intelligent basis. Not to be pedantic, not to show off, but just to justify that what I'm doing is just like not something I, you know, whipped out at a bus stop. Is there any more questions? Oh, the sculptures. Okay. Yes, thanks for bringing that up. I always have been a sculptor, and I learned sculpting in college. The thing about sculpture is it's a three-dimensional thing like we are, and we can walk around it and understand its volume, and it's a thing like it's in our world. But you can't have the emotional feeling of a sky or a landscape or an environment with it. So you trade one off for the other. The sculptures, I love the sculptures. The sculptures are expensive. They're hard to move. It's just everything about them. Now, I have hand sculpted these sculptures, but I have to have a crew to polish them out and sand them and make them perfect. So you get into some enormous expense. These exist because I had underwriters that underwrote the sketches. Now, if you on the outside wall here, there's two sketches of sculptures that were done that I submitted to underwriters to come up with big hunks of money so these can exist. These are obviously comic book looking things. You know, they're not pop art. They exist on their own, and they are in some respects nonsensical. I would like to think of them as more of abstract thinking, but I don't know. These went over very well in New York, and the Tony Shafrazi Gallery used to be my gallery in New York, and they were very well received. I know one went to Moscow, one went to Switzerland, another one went to Miami. There was a big interest in it, but just dealing with them is, having them trucked and having a crew come and move them, and then when you move them, you scratch them, and they got to be touched up and everything. Oh Christ! I'm not to the success level that I can deal with these things. Anyway, the paintings, I can put skies and storms and environments. Control the color, and they're a little more easier to deal with, and so that's the story on the sculpture.
You typically work and you finish one painting, then move on to the next. You kind of work through.
Most of the time. Sometimes the simpler paintings I'll line up a bunch of them and do the simpler paintings in process. But these real tight paintings that you see here are painted in 3 layers of oil paint, very thin coats. Man, there ain't no break on these paintings. Here's undercolors and stuff on here. There's a neuroses in these paintings. And after they age and the paint starts weakening, then the undercolor starts coming up. So the painting has a second character to it. So I don't know. I can babble about it all day, technically, but there's in doing reading about art, 100 years ago, there was a cult of artists that saw metaphysics and magic and technique, and they had to use special paints that had some magic significance, and they couldn't use certain tools, and they just had to use certain kind of brushes. So you can get really carried away in the technique of these things. You can go way overboard to a mysticism. Is there any other questions? Yes?
Just about, you use oil primarily.
It's all, 99% of this is oil paint.
And is there a reason that you use, I'm assuming you use plenty of acrylic at some point, but is there a reason behind sticking with oil?
I was fortunate enough to start painting before there were acrylics. So I learned to paint with oil paint. Oil painting is difficult. I remember when I was a young kid trying to paint with oil paint, man, that was like trying to paint with colored Vaseline. It was frustrating. But sometimes I will use acrylic on rush jobs or
It
some
seems like
lettering
it's
or
just
something
came a
like
long
that.
way.
Pardon?
It seems like it's came a long way now with the ability with acrylic. And if you're using oil very thinly, I just wonder if you would still notice a difference if you went to
Well,
use acrylic with the same imagery.
Acrylic is a little deader, a little flatter looking. Oil paint's got a real deep richness. And if you paint with acrylics, I know there's a lot of people do, if you paint with acrylics, you got about 7 or 8 techniques and then you run aground. But oil painting, as old as I am, I'm still learning new stuff with oil paint. You just never quit learning with oil paint. You know, there's all kinds of little tricks and maneuvers, and you over the years you learn the viscosity of the paint, the drying times, and what pigments to use. It's a continually learning process, you know. So, did you have a question?
Yeah, since these are so, every painting's so jam-packed with imagery and content, is there any bit, like, do you do writing as well?
Yeah,
Like,
I do the
any
writing before I do
process?
the painting. I look off the sketches and figure out how I'm going to write about it.
Yeah.
The paintings are not dependent on the writing, but the writing helps.
Is that
The
where, like,
writing really helps.
ideas
And
come
there's a thing about the writing is it locks people on the wall longer. In other words, people come here and just look through their periphery or their eye and they're gone, you know. But I try to like lock people on these walls. You know.
Well, I mean, like, in idea development, like, if you have a sketchbook, are you sketching, is there a lot of writing in your
I
sketchbooks?
work with a thesaurus, you know. I do a lot of reading. Me and my wife have a large library, and you know, these things are over-thought out, really. And you mentioned the density, the visual density on them, and that's called horror-vacue, the fear of open spaces. And a lot of people would say, well, that's because you're mentally weak and you have to fill up every area. And there is a certain truth in that. There's a certain virtuosity in that. But I like to pride myself on thinking that there is composition here. You know, that I'm the conductor and I orchestrate the use of color and the design of the painting. You know, I like to think of myself in that virtuosity. I know it's a little overboard. It's going to play tomorrow on Berry Street. It's the history of me and the psychedelic art movement and the history of underground comics. It took 20 years to make this film. It went through 3 film companies. It's got a lot of celebrities in it, and it's got a lot of rich history, and I would really appreciate it if you come to see this movie, because it'll put all of this into perspective for you. It's got a lot of interesting points of the history of art and what's been going on in the last 20 or 30 years in this direction. And if you have any interest in this sort of thing, this would be the movie to see. And they sell the DVD here of it. And I don't know how to hype it any better than that. You know? Well, I was kind of thinking money, but that was a joke. You know, it's ego and drive. You know, I'm not a virtuous person. I'm not I'm not an angel. You know. And I love to look at the stuff, and I love people's response on it.
Seems like one of the themes is artist versus his art. You know?
Well, now there is about 10 artists in the country that are in this school of art that have this caliber of work that have made lots of money, way exceeded me. So I don't know. I guess it's a solid thing now. Now, if they get beyond me, they start falling off into that Thomas Kincaid thing. He and Tupac. You know, a lot of them start getting a reputation inside art, then you start toning it down where it'll fit in your living room, and you can have your family over, and the pastor can come over and have coffee. You know, but you know, this is I'm on the woolly side of this thing. Believe me, I'm a lot more tamer than I was. I was just so I don't know. You know, you walk around here, you got criticism. Your criticism's probably valid. You know, I can't force this on you, intellectual flowers or anything. You know, so I got to check, see what time it is. I'm running out of time here. I got about 10 or 15. What?
close are you to the sketches when you put them on canvas? Do you stick with them pretty strictly with what you had drawn out, or do you have more times where you're open to move?
Each painting is made up of maybe 10 or 15 sketches that have been worked and reworked and worked and reworked, you know. And you think, well, this guy must be calculating his audience. Well, no. I remember when we were doing underground comics and we didn't know what our audience was, and all the artists that did underground comics had it in their mind of what they thought their audience was. So they thought, well, these are young intellectuals. And then they started having comic book conventions. Then you realize that these little people that come to read these underground comics are kind of sad, you know. So maybe it would have been best to not what the audience was. But I have to pursue my anxieties on what these things are going to turn out to look like. You know. Yes.
The humor is just apparent. I mean, comics have lost that for me.
Yeah.
This is comical.
Yeah, you're in a comic book here.
Yeah.
When you walk around here, you're walking in a comic book. Yeah. Years ago, in the early 50s, comic books, a lot of them were really great craftsmanship and whatnot. And they started exceeding the audience of young children. And they had remarkable writers and some of the finest draftsmen of the 20th century. But they started getting a little licentious and a little too adventurous. So in 1952, a famous writer, Dr. Frederick Wortham, come out with a best-selling book called Seduction of the Innocent. And this pointed out juvenile delinquency was springing out of comic books. So they had a Senate investigation to control comic books. So anyway, they outlawed about half the comic books, and the comic book code come along. And so all of a sudden, I'm a little kid, and I get these great comic books, and then I go to the drugstore to get another comic, and they're not there anymore. So it's like I'm hurt. And then I found out from other friends later, these comic books, the absence of these comic books had a great effect on a lot of people. And then when we started underground comics, well, this was revenge, you know, because there was no, the most vile things that you could think of was in underground comics. But the underground comics weren't for young kids, they were for older people that wanted to enrich your imagination. There's like enormous amount of gratuitous sex and violence in it, but it was so ridiculous that how could you act out such stupid storylines? So anyway, underground comics had an enormous effect on this. You know, I was in a show in L.A. and the New York Times says, well, going into that show was like walking around in a Zap Comix, you know, and that's actually what you're walking around in a comic book here. And this stuff has absolutely no responsibility of wall decoration. You know, that's out of the picture. You know. These things have to be an entity unto themselves. Was there any more questions?